The Art Newspaper podcast is brought to you in association with Bonhams, auctioneers since 1793. To find out more, visit bonhams.com. Hello and welcome to the Art Newspaper podcast. I'm Ben Luke. Thanks for listening. This week it's a Titian special. We're taking an in-depth look at the new exhibition at the National Gallery in London. Before we start, a reminder that you can read the Art Newspaper anywhere, anytime with our iPhone and iPad app. Visit the App Store, search for the Art Newspaper, and from there you can install the free app. If you're a subscriber, all the app content is available as part of your subscription. Now, for the first time in around 440 years, 6 paintings by the Venetian Renaissance master Titian, known as the poesie, which were made for Philip II, King of Spain in the 1550s and 60s, are being reunited at the National Gallery in London. Lucian Freud described 2 of the 6 paintings as simply the most beautiful pictures in the world. A 7th picture, intended to be sent to Philip but never delivered, completes the set of masterpieces in the National Gallery's exhibition. The paintings feature mythological scenes inspired by Ovid's narrative poem Metamorphoses. Until last year, this gathering of the poesie could not have happened because institutions in London and Boston wouldn't lend the works, but now they're together on the National Gallery's walls. So before I looked at the paintings in depth with the show's curator, Matthias Wivel, I spoke to Gabriele Finaldi, the director of the National Gallery, about how they achieved what was once thought impossible. Gabriele, until last year, we didn't think this was possible. What happened?
Well, in some ways, you're right. This was the sort of the impossible show, the show you dream of being able to do, but know that you can't. What changed that was fundamentally that the museum in Boston, the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, decided that they could lend their painting of Europa and the Bull. That is a picture that's never been lent since it went to America in the early 20th century. So that was the first important step. And that's what led us to really kind of expand our ambition and see if we could do the whole set. And then, you're right, the key moment was back in November last year when the Wallace Collection trustees agreed that they could change the long-standing tradition of not being able to lend, and they told us that they could lend the Perseus and Andromeda. There were leaps of joy in the National Gallery when that news came through, you can imagine.
Yeah. And for you, as current director of the National Gallery, previously you were deputy director at the Prado. These are 2 institutions which have very different collections in lots of ways, but one of the things that really unites them is that they have incredible holdings of Titian. So can you say something about what Titian means to you, having been in these 2 august institutions with amazing collections?
In some ways you could say that Titian is a sort of embodiment of painting. It sounds like a grand thing to say, but particularly with my former Prado hat on, the tradition of painting in Spain is very much based on Titian. Titian is considered the foundation on which the tradition of painterly painting is based. And you only need to think of El Greco, Velázquez himself, but also Murillo and Rubens, who in a way was a kind of Spanish painter as well. So all those artists who paint in a certain way where, the touch is very important, where, the broken stroke, the intensity of colour, the sort of storytelling, all of them see Titian as their fountainhead. And the National Gallery too, of course, is very strong in those artists, Rubens and Titian in particular. So in many ways we owe Titian a lot in these 2 institutions. It was one of the reasons why it was possible to think of doing the show, because there's such a good dynamic between the National Gallery London and the Prado Madrid.
I think one of the things that, as I've been talking to people about this show, is, occasionally people will say to me, is it a bit academic, isn't it sort of a curator's dream, but is it a public dream? I think when you're in this space, you realise that it's just a room full of stonking paintings.
It's a very serious academic project, there's no doubt about that, and those who want to see all the research that's been done and is being done on these pictures, and it's very, very interesting. It's in the catalogue, but I think you only need to step in the space, as you say, to see that this is an exhibition to really relish and really enjoy. You don't need to be an expert in the Renaissance, you don't need to be an expert in Ovidian poetry. You really need to stand in front of the picture and just enjoy the sheer glory of the storytelling, of the richness of the colour, of the amazing way in which he composes his pictures. They really are pictures for the senses, starting with your sense of sight. but then all your senses get engaged, and you really feel enveloped by these stories.
Indeed. One really striking element of this is that you've chosen to stage it in the main galleries. We're standing here in daylight, and it seems to me that this is a crucial factor. If you're going to show Titian's that famous colour of Titian, to have daylight assist you in that is quite important, isn't it?
I do think that's very important, because it's very important to think about the circumstances in which the paintings were made, and Titian's painting is all about light and colour. And if you want to approximate the conditions in which these pictures were made and in which these pictures were seen, then it needs to be natural light, preferably a lot of sunlight that we don't get much of in March and April in London. But there have been moments, even this morning, when the clouds moved across the sky, let the sunlight in, and it really is glorious.
You almost hear angels sing.
There's an intensity. The blues become more blue, the pinks become pinker. Everything seems to sort of come alive in natural light. Obviously, those coming in the evening will see it in natural light, in artificial light, which looks fantastic too. But there we are. We've got a bit of sunlight right now, and I'm just looking at the rape of Europa, look at that flash of red in the drape that's flying across the sky, and that big bit of blue above the mountains on the left. It is just stunning.
And that was cleaned, wasn't it, for this? So, it's an international project in all sorts of ways, and one of the ways is a sort of conservation project.
Exactly. So there's been a lot of historical work done. We've been looking at documents. We've presented all the letters relating to the series of the poesie in translation in the catalogue. There's also a lot of technical work been done, so we now understand much better how Titian worked. Titian was an artist who, when he came up with a good invention, sort of kept using it, and there are a couple of pictures in the show where we can see him having used an earlier composition but reworking it, doing it slightly differently. And of course the cleaning, as you say, so it's the Boston picture, it's the Europa and the Bull, Rape of Europa, which has been cleaned specifically for the show. But effectively, the Titian from the Prado, the Venus and Adonis, the Danae from the Wellington collection, those were cleaned when I was at the Prado. That's about, I suppose, 8 years ago now.
So they were all in really good nick, actually. I mean, obviously these are paintings which are, best part of 500 years old, so that there's bits of wear and tear, but they seem so luminous still.
Yes, and also, when you do a show, obviously you need to think about making the pictures look their best, and the artist look his best in this case. So with the picture from the Wallace collection, which everybody knows is quite a damaged picture, but in the new frames that we've made for all the pictures, and with very sensitive lighting and situating it within this kind of series context, I think the picture has never looked better.
We're a bit euphoric in the interview so far, but I have to ask you a trickier question. Everybody is thinking about coronavirus right now. This is a major show. It's taken years of preparation. It's a major part of your programme for this year. There is the potential, museums are closing all over Europe, that you will have to interrupt the public's experience of this. Can you tell me what is the current position on coronavirus?
So the current position is business as usual. As a national institution, we're listening very carefully to what the official advice from government is. We are being constantly briefed, and we have to be very attentive to that, clearly. We have heard the news. We've just heard that the Irish museums are closed, the Spanish museums are closed, the Italian museums are closed. As you know, we have a show which is currently in Japan, which was put up on the wall, beautifully lit, beautifully presented, and couldn't open. That still hasn't opened yet. So we're in a very fluid situation. We have contingency plans here at the gallery. For the time being, it's business as usual, and I'm delighted that we've been able to open this show, and I hope that we'll be able to enable lots of people to come and see it.
One last question. Artemisia is due to open in a few weeks' time, and obviously that has pictures coming from Italy. Do you know yet whether those pictures will be able to travel from Italy?
So we're in the planning phase to bring those pictures over. We're in touch with our Italian counterparts. We're in touch with the transport agencies, clearly. It's looking as if things can go ahead, and that's certainly our intention. If the circumstances change, we will, of course, let everybody know. We certainly want to do the show. The catalogue is ready. It's a very beautiful show. We've had spectacular collaboration from all the lenders. It will be a very, very beautiful show.
Great. Well, thank you, Gabriele, and good luck with it all.
Thank you very much indeed.
Before we discuss the paintings, and while we're talking about the coronavirus, here are this week's top news stories on our website. The COVID-19 coronavirus continues to prompt the cancellation of major events and the closure of museums. At TFAF, the old master fair in Maastricht, an art dealer tested positive for coronavirus, and the fair was forced to close early. Museums across Europe have closed. Austrian museum directors have decided to close all federal public museums until the end of March. Polish officials announced the closure of their museums for 2 weeks from the 12th of March, and Spanish museums, including the Prado and Reina Sofia in Madrid, also closed until further notice. Meanwhile, in France, the culture minister, Franck Riester, tested positive for the virus, while some museums are allowing limited visits. The list of closures and postponements is increasing hour by hour, so do keep up to date at theartnewspaper.com or on the app. 4 North American museums have cancelled plans to host a major touring exhibition of masterworks from Liechtenstein's princely collections out of apparent concern over the royal family's wartime record. The show, encompassing more than 85 works spanning 5 centuries, was to have opened at the National Gallery of Canada in Ottawa on the 5th of June and remained there until the 7th of September before travelling to Seattle, to Fort Worth in Texas and to the National Gallery of Art in Washington DC. But all 4 venues have cancelled the show. The National Gallery of Canada said in a statement, after deliberating on new information related to estates in Austria owned by the royal family of Liechtenstein during the Second World War, the National Gallery of Canada decided not to participate. The UK Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, confirmed in a budget this week that his government, under Prime Minister Boris Johnson, will establish a £250 million fund to support local museums and neighbourhood libraries. The budget, the first delivered since the UK left the European Union in January, also paves the way for a series of controversial free ports to be built across the country. The £250 million fund was announced in the Conservative manifesto last November. The money could go some way to filling the gap left by the loss of numerous public libraries over the past 3 years. In 2018 alone, more than 130 libraries were forced to close due to the Conservative government's austerity drive over the past decade. You can read all these stories and much more at theartnewspaper.com and on the app. Now to those Titian paintings. Made at the height of Titian's powers, they've long been celebrated, among much else, for their virtuosic, expressive painterly techniques, for their dynamic compositions, and for their sensual depiction of the female body, all of which, as Gabriele says, profoundly influenced the course of painting over the following centuries. But it's impossible to look at them today and not acknowledge that for all their sensuality, they also depict and even celebrate the gods' violence against women, with scenes of abduction and enchainment. In a video accompanying the show, the classicist Mary Beard addresses this question.
There's a lot of difficulty now, both about Ovid's poem and about Titian's dialogue with Ovid's poem. I feel much more doubtful, not to say fairly hostile to the view that that means so we shouldn't read it or so we shouldn't look at it. I think unless we face up to what rape is, we're lost. That's what we need to know. There is something we need to look at, see and recognise here. Put these in the cupboard, we're depriving ourselves of something which is going to make us think harder and better and more productively about what sexual violence is.
I took a tour of the show's 7 works with Matthias Wivel, the National Gallery's curator of 16th century Italian paintings and the curator of the exhibition. And if you want to look at the paintings while we're discussing them, you can see the online slideshow that we've created at theartnewspaper.com. Just follow the podcast tab. Matthias, before we get into the specifics of the works, can we sort of set the scene in terms of the artist and the patron? So, Philip II, who is he? What's his status at the point where the commission begins?
So the commission begins in Augsburg in 1550 to 51. Philip at that point is Prince of Spain, soon to be king, and he knows that. He has been traveling Europe, preparing to eventually be crowned king, and at this point potentially even be put forward as Holy Roman Emperor by his father, Charles V.
That's right, so Charles V is both Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain.
Right, and the Netherlands. It's Spain and the Netherlands, and colonies across the Atlantic as well. So it's a very big... Charles had an enormous empire, and even what Philip ends up ruling is pretty considerable, even though he doesn't become emperor. He becomes King of Spain and the Netherlands and retains dominion over parts of Italy, and indeed the overseas colonies.
Right, so he's essentially pretty much the most powerful man in the world, even still.
At least one of them.
Yeah. So one of the things about Philip II is, in fiction especially, but also in some biographies, he's presented as this deeply pious, austere man. And yet surrounding us we have sensuously painted naked women.
Yeah.
What was the reality, I suppose, of Philip II's character?
I don't think he was ever that pious. I think he became pious because that was the role he was setting up for himself. The image we have him as of a very severe, pious king comes later. He's still young at this point, and he's not, I don't think, particularly... I mean, he's religious like everybody, but he's not that invested in that part. Later on, he puts himself forward. He stages himself as the most Catholic king, and I think that, in a way, becomes a self-fulfilling role. You know, he becomes pious because of that. But this is later. This is not at this period. This period, he's young. He's interested in women and having fun, and I think he's also ambitious, and he is aware that he has massive responsibility coming. So there's a combination of youthful pursuits, enthusiasm, and ambition, and probably a bit of anxiety about the responsibility that awaits him.
Does he just simply inherit Titian from his father, as it were? Because, you know, his father was a great patron of Titian already. So does he just inherit his love of Titian from his dad?
He certainly knows Titian's art through the collection, his father's pictures from Titian, and also his aunt, Mary of Hungary, who I think was very helpful in educating him about art. She had, I think, more nuanced appreciation of art than Charles. Charles adored Titian, and they got along extremely well, but he was not somebody who was interested in the range of what Titian could provide. So I think, in a way, Philip is trying to emulate his father. He takes over the artist that works for his father. But I think he also actively pursues a distinct path in terms of what he commissions, and that leads to him becoming one of the great, great patrons of art in European history.
So at this stage, Titian is relatively old, isn't he? He's sort of 60 when the commission begins. Is it too much to say that he was the most famous painter or the most esteemed painter?
I think definitely the most painter, and tied with Michelangelo for most famous artist.
Right.
But definitely the most famous painter in Europe, and working for the highest level of European society. He was working for the Holy Roman Emperor, for the Pope, and so on, you know, like dukes and princes, and it's that level that he's working at.
Does the fact that Titian has that status lead to the fact that there is so much freedom in this commission, in the sense that, you know, Philip basically gives him his head, doesn't he? He just says, just go for it.
I think Philip is confident that he will deliver, but it is still, even if, his status probably plays into it, but I think Philip also senses that this is what Titian wants to do, and that if he's going to get the best work from Titian, he should let him do this. I think there's a part. They probably have discussions going on, and I think Philip understands Titian and what, just as Titian clearly understands what Philip wants. I think Philip understands better what Titian wants than his father did.
And what we get is this sequence of mythological pictures, and wonderfully in the room next door here we've got an example of a great mythological picture that Titian made in the 1520s, the Bacchus and Ariadne, which was from another sequence. Yes. Do you think Titian had that sequence in mind when he made this one?
Yes, absolutely. Again, you can't prove it, but the fact that this series, the Poesie, the Philip series, is commissioned at a time when Philip doesn't have a permanent residence. He's moving around Europe, preparing to become king. He doesn't have a permanent residence. It's impossible, I think, that he would have a specific destination in mind for these pictures. Titian describes in one of the early letters about the series that he imagines them in a camerino, a smaller gallery, a stud, sort of something between a study and a gallery, you know. But
a place for sort of private
a private
experience.
that's what he's imagining. And surely what he's imagining is the Camerino dell'Abbastro in the Ducal Palace in Ferrara, which he had decorated in the late teens and early 20s. And the other factor that supports that hypothesis is the fact that he adopts the same format as those pictures, for these pictures. At that time, at the time when he was painting in Ferrara, or for Ferrara, the format was stipulated because it was site-specific what he was doing. So the format and the subject matter was stipulated. Here, subject matter is not stipulated, and I can't imagine the format is because there's no set destination that we know of. So probably he's thinking of that room. He's imagining that room as he's developing this series. And he has found that this almost square format works well for the kind of picture that he's going to be executing for Philip.
Now, you talk about an almost square format. We're standing before a painting now which is in landscape format, but it wasn't at one stage.
Right. This is Danae. This is the first of the pictures of the poesie that Titian did for Philip. It may have been started as early as 1551 in Augsburg when they were together. Right. I imagine that this was a famous/infamous picture at this point, or did this composition. Titian had already done one Danae for Alessandro Farnese, the cardinal in Rome, and it was sort of scandalous and exciting to people who had seen it because it was so sexy. Titian had outdone himself.
That's right, because he'd done the Venus of Urbino, which is the famous picture in the Uffizi, and that was seen as a hugely sensual image, but he's upped the game again.
Yeah, we have a contemporary describing that, saying that the Urbino Venus looks like a nun compared to Danae. So it's that level, and I can imagine Philip saying, "Can I have one of these?" We don't know, but it's certainly the first picture Titian does for Philip.
Right.
And he sends it to him in 1553 from Venice. So it gets sent to Spain, because at that point Philip is back in Spain. And what is different in this picture from the previous Danae is that it's not originally landscape format. Danae is landscape. He adapts the landscape composition of Danae to the square format that he's going to use for this series of pictures. And so the pictures we see in front of us, through the vagaries of history and so on, has been cut down to like something close to the format of the previous Danae, and indeed of the other replicas Titian did later, including the very beautiful one that's in the Prado that was for a long time thought to be Philip's Danae, but is actually a later picture. So what we know of this picture is that from an early copy, we know that the top part that is now missing had the image of Jupiter in the cloud, the golden cloud from which the golden shower emerges to impregnate Danae. And there was an image of his attribute of an eagle. And we know that from quite a mediocre, if not to say very inferior, early copy, Flemish copy. And that was Titian's way of adapting it to the square format, to incorporate those elements. He did reuse the image of Jupiter in later replicas, though not the one in the Prado. But then in the 18th century, this picture gets separated from the others actually already in the 17th century. It's in a different palace, the Buen Retiro, and there it's damaged. And in 1772, it is taken out of the Buen Retiro to the new royal palace in Madrid for conservation and marked as particularly damaged. I imagine, we don't know why, but I imagine that it probably had water damage at the top. So it was cut down to eliminate the parts that were like beyond salvage.
So it wasn't an aesthetic choice as it might have been. No.
It seems quite clear that it's restoration, and we even know the guy who did it, Andrés de Calleja.
Oh, right. Amazing.
So that's what's happened to this picture. It's quite a damaged picture. The surface is damaged across the painting, and so it's a little harder to appreciate in some ways than the others. Although I think enough remains to see the brilliance of Titian's application.
It is still absolutely spectacular, isn't it? Yeah. So one of the things about this series that's interesting is the sort of conventional narrative about Titian's painting style is that he just gets looser decade by decade. But one of the things one notices looking at these pictures is actually his style shifts even within this sequence.
Yeah, and within the same painting. It's
right.
This is an example of that. So Danae is the result of a transfer from some kind of cartoon, outline cartoon or something, because it's a figure he'd already designed. So she's transferred, and you can see that in the infrared. infrared reflectogram, you can see the way that the lines, the contour lines, are transfer lines. However, the Old Woman, which is a new introduction to the iconography here. I mean, it's not to the iconography, but to Titian's version, it's a new introduction. She's underdrawn freehand, and you can see that because the surface is so damaged that you can actually see through it and see Titian's construction lines, which are freehand underdrawn, not transfer. And the whole figure, what remains of the surface paint, is much more vigorously applied. It's very energetic.
Yeah.
And it actually kind of looks like Titian a bit, in other paintings where he works in a freer idiom than he does otherwise in this picture. So there's a real contrast there.
Really muscular arms in the old lady. Yeah, incredible painting. Right, let's move on to the next one.
So, in the year after consigning Danae, Titian sends the second poesie to Philip, and Philip by this time is in London, having recently married Mary Tudor and become King Consort of England. So he becomes King of England, in name at least, before he becomes King of Spain in 1556. Mm-hmm. And that picture is Venus and Adonis, which again is based on a pre-existing composition that Titian has done several times before. So it's again a transfer that he then works up to his most beautiful version of that particular composition. He would subsequently do many of them. It became very popular after he did this one for Philip. It was issued as several prints, right, and became very famous. And it's really the condensation of Titian's ability, the quintessential condensation of Titian's abilities as a storyteller.
Yeah, because there's so much in this. It's almost like the whole story in one image, right?
Yeah. He suggests before and after in one salient moment of departure, of lovers parting at dawn, which is a common literary motif, but which he takes the story from Ovid and uses that motif to tell that story and to extend it temporally to before and after, as well as the present. So we see from Venus' nakedness and the fact that she's sitting on her garment, an overturned flagon on the ground, and indeed the fact that Cupid has collapsed against the tree and is asleep behind them, that this has been preceded by a night of lovemaking. It's quite clear. Adonis is fully dressed and is departing with his hounds, and they're sniffing and pawing at the ground because they are scenting their prey.
They're very eager.
Yeah, so he's going away. We know that, but Titian captures all this the salient moment of hesitation, which, depending on the choice he makes, everything changes. Venus is sensing that he's going off to his death. He doesn't understand that. She's trying to explain it. She's pleading with him. She's trying to explain what will happen if he leaves. And he's dragging her, like her body is turning as he's dragging it because she's holding on to him and he's breaking free of her grip. And that way he looks back and sort of slight uncomprehending. It really encapsulates the story, that moment of misunderstanding between them.
This was the pendant to Danae, right? So
yes.
But obviously the most notable thing is in one you have a nude from the front, and in this you have a very, very famous painted back.
Yeah, very famous. And this is specified in a letter that Titian ostensibly sends to Philip. We don't know for sure because the only copy we have of it, or the only version we have of it, is in the publication, is a book where it's published as a famous letter by Titian in 1554. So that's the year, and it's surely written by Ludovico Dolce, who was Titian's friend, who was a translator of Ovid and a man of letters and like a very prolific writer. And he surely wrote that letter. But, with the understanding that Titian would know the content. He helped Titian with his letters. Titian was not a natural-born writer. He was a visual artist. Right. In that letter, Titian specifies to Philip that I'm sending you this picture of Venus and Adonis in complement to the one I sent you before, the Danae, and you'll be excited because in this picture I'm showing the woman from the opposite side. And that enters into a whole discussion of contemporary aesthetics and sort of intellectual discourse around art. It's in part a reference to the so-called Paragonia debates where intellectuals and artists would debate the individual merits of different art forms, and where sculpture could be seen in a round while painting was two-dimensional, and so was one superior to the other. Painting had color, sculpture didn't, and so on. And being able to show a woman from different angles, as Titian is doing here, is a way of competing with the three-dimensionality of sculpture, just as Titian, in a way, through his choice of the word poesia to describe these pictures, which is an established term, it's not something Titian comes up with, it's established, is making a claim for painting to be equal to poetry, which is regarded as a liberal art, whereas painting is still sort of dragging itself out of the understanding of it as artisanal.
Right.
So there's a paragone with literature, and there's a paragone with sculpture. This is the more intellectual side of it.
Yeah.
I think the more interesting side of it, in a way, which again is intellectual to an extent. It's a reference to, there's a different letter that Dolce writes to a Venetian collector, where he describes Titian's greatest new picture. And in that, he compares that famous back. He describes, how wonderfully painted it is. And indeed, it's as finished and as subtle as anything Titian paints in this period. And he specifically describes how the skin of her buttocks is sort of a press against her seat and so on. And then he goes on to say that this will excite you. And he compares it to the story of the Venus of Cnidus, the sculpture of Venus by Praxiteles, known from Pliny, which was exhibited in the round so you could see it all the way around, and so excited a young man that he masturbated against it. So he's referring to that, and this is not just prurience. This is a way of claiming supremacy in art. To do something so seemingly real that you get excited about it physically is a mark of a great artist, and that's very important to Venetian aesthetics.
Let's move on to Perseus and Andromeda.
Yes, so where the two first poesie, Danae and Venus and Adonis, were based on pre-existing compositions, Perseus and Andromeda is a new invention. And this is because Titian has a little bit more time now. He has been spending the last few years serving a lot of different patrons, not just Philip, but his father Charles and the extended Habsburg family, mostly doing portraits, but also some religious pictures for them. And that has to the point where he's so overworked that there are rumors going around the Spanish court that he's died. He hasn't. Those rumors are overstated. But he's really overworked, and I think he's really sick of painting portraits. Although he's one of the great portraitists of all time, I think he's sick of it by this point. And now he has a little bit more time.
And he's painting a monster.
Yeah, he's really, he's going all out here. He really wants this to be the most impressive picture he's ever painted, I think. You really get that sense from looking at it and from looking at what's underneath the surface, because this is a composition that was changed again and again. He made many, many changes on the canvas while working on it, trying to get it right, moving the figure of Andromeda, that ends up in this beautiful balletic pose on the left. She was at one time on the right. She had her arms up rather than one of them down. Her hips were turned differently. And then getting that very complex foreshortened pose of Perseus right. It's indecipherable what's underneath it, but there are many changes to that figure in the initial lay-in of the figure. Once he starts painting it, he has it down, more or less. He changes the position of the arms and the shield a bit and the sword. But here he's trying to do something that he's not ultimately maybe that comfortable with, is storytelling in depth. And this is something that's kind of new in Venice because there's a young upstart named Tintoretto who is great at these very kinetic compositions with figures flying through the air and often tells his story in depth, has a lot of depth of field, where Titian generally is a storyteller sort of who uses the surface, the front of the foreground as almost sort of frieze-like type of composition. You will have a lot of atmospheric recession and landscape and so on, but it's not the actual story happens in the foreground. And here he's struggling a bit with that, I would say. Nevertheless, he comes up with a very sort of psychologically interesting picture.
At this point in the sequence is one of the enduring themes of the rest of the sequence, which is water. Yeah. And he's a great painter of water. He's a great painter of spume. Yeah. There's an extraordinary bubbling sea from which this monster is emerging.
It's quite curious, actually, and this is something that generations of critics and scholars have talked about, why Venetian artists don't paint the sea. They paint the land, they don't paint the sea, and there are various explanations for that. And even Titian, there isn't that much before this. Right. He's starting to paint the sea here. Obviously, he paints streams and rivers and so on, and water pouring from, that kind of thing. He's always interested in water. But this is really his first sea piece, and it's very dramatic. And yeah, indeed, it gives him a license to get really expressive. He's starting to, I think, figure out how far he can take painting with this picture. Unfortunately, it's quite damaged, so we can't quite appreciate just how stunning this would have been when it was.
But compositionally, I mean, you're talking about how Tintoretto's kind of almost laid down a gauntlet for Titian, and he's really risen. I mean, the tumbling figure of Perseus, as you say, the balletic pose of Andromeda. It's an extraordinarily dynamic composition.
Absolutely. And there's a very interesting contrast between the grace and composure of Andromeda, who's chained, she's restrained, and this sort of clumsy, slightly possibly bumbling aspect, violent and chaotic aspect to Perseus, the man, who does not seem to be in control. She seems to be much more in control, even though she's the one who's not free.
Right.
And I think that's interesting.
We've got a bit of audio from Mary Beard talking on the film that accompanies this exhibition about looking at these pictures, which do suggest violence to women.
Yeah.
Well, not just suggest, they depict violence towards women. Yeah. Can you say something about, was this something which, we think about this as a sort of titillating group of paintings. What would the interpretation of this imagery of violence have been in the 16th century?
It's very hard to say. What contemporary descriptions we have do emphasize the titillation, like written descriptions. And that is clearly part of what these pictures do, and are meant to do. They are meant to be exciting to the male viewer. And, a picture like this, there's almost a sort of BDSM quality to the way she's chained and displayed to us. So that's definitely part of the intention. However, Titian is somebody who never seems content with that kind of just operating on one level. And if you think about Titian's career, the first documented paintings by Titian are the frescoes he did in Padua in the Scuola del Santo. It's for a meeting hall. This is in 1511, the first documented. It's not the first pictures by him, the first documented. It's for a meeting hall that only admitted men. All three pictures are about women done wrong. And indeed, like two of them, women subjected to violence, and where the sympathy is clearly with the woman. And so even though we don't have contemporary descriptions explaining this, one should not ignore the evidence of what we see. And I think this continues throughout his career. He is somebody with, as an artist at least, has an enormous amount of empathy and places his empathy with certain figures in the compositions, and often with the women.
Because she is struggling. I mean, and looking at her face is a face of torment.
Yeah. And the thing is, she has been subjected to this. I mean, the torment of having to be chained to a rock and the monster coming for her, through no fault of her own. She's offered up as a sacrifice to Neptune, the sea god. But also the fact that Perseus, before Perseus falls in love with her, as Ovid describes it. He comes by, he happens to be flying by, he sees her, falls in love with her. And then he decides, I'll save her, I'll kill this monster that's encroaching upon her. But before he does that, he goes and secures her hand in marriage with her parents.
Right.
So Titian is getting at that aspect of the story too. This is an arranged marriage that she has no say in. And that was quite normal at the time. There was nothing unusual about that. But Ovid's story already suggests a discomfort there. And I think Titian builds on that discomfort. And that's why she's restrained and he's free, and he's the one who's really driven by his desires and his irrationality much more than she is. And I think that's the interesting tension for me in this picture.
We'll be back discussing the other four poesia after this. Belgian artist Leon Spriliert has not always received the public attention in Britain that his talents deserve. Exhibitions in London this spring at the Royal Academy, the first ever UK retrospective of the artist's work, and at Bonhams are set to redress this lack of exposure and to place his oeuvre alongside that of the foremost symbolist and expressionist artists. The Bonhams exhibition, Leon Spriliert, A Discerning Eye, runs from the 20th to the 26th of March at 101 New Bond Street, London, and consists of 12 works, all gathered from private collections in Belgium. It spans the whole of Spriliert's career, from the sombre and anguished paintings of his early period to the later, brighter and more optimistic works. Bonham's head of Impressionist and modern art, Hannah Foster, said Leon Spriliert's work resonates deeply with modern concerns. He was one of the earliest artists to embrace subjectivity and explore themes of alienation, existential torment and loneliness. A 1920 work by Spriliert also features in Bonham's Impressionist and Modern Art sale in London later in March. To read Adrian Locke's story about Leon Spriliert in Bonham's magazine, visit bonhams.com. Welcome back. So now let's head back to the National, where we begin by discussing Diana and Actaeon and Diana and Callisto. So paintings 4 and 5 in the sequence, you've hung them close together on a single wall. There are lots of reasons for this, aren't there? So first of all, let's talk about the subject matter. They both feature Diana.
Yeah. So at this point, Titian has sent in 1556, he sends the Perseus and Andromeda to Philip, and it's in Brussels, and then it gets taken back to Spain. And by this point, Philip has negotiated a very important peace agreement with France, and he has taken a new queen, the Princess of France, and has set up court in Toledo. So he's returning to Spain. And Titian, in the meantime, is working on these pictures. And it takes him a long time to finish them. And he's working on them concurrently. It's two pictures clearly meant as a pair. Like we discussed before how Venus and Adonis and Danae were Titian describes them as complements to each other, as pendants. He takes that idea further here with two pictures that are clearly meant to be seen together. The landscape that encloses these figures continues across the surface when you hang them the way we've done here, so that the stream in front has this bow shape in front, continuing across, and the hill that goes that you see rising towards the right in Diana and Actaeon, then comes down at the other end in Diana and Callisto. So I think these are definitely meant to be seen together, and almost certainly in this configuration, although what is slightly strange is that they are painted as if lit from opposite directions. And that is surprising, because usually Titian does that on purpose. And he does that with reference to where they're going to hang. And as we've discussed earlier, the impression we have is that there was no specific destination for these pictures. It is not unthinkable that by this point, when Philip is setting up court in Toledo, he is thinking of a space and has told Titian in some document that we've lost that this is what he wants. It's possible. We don't know, but it is clearly remarkable that they're lit from opposite sides. Yeah. All the other poesie are lit from the left, but this Diana and Callisto is lit from the right. And that would indicate, if we are to accept that they are meant to be seen together in this way, Diana and Actaeon on the left, Diana and Callisto on the right, that they would be between two windows in a very large room. Right. Because if you put the window between them or put them opposite walls, you lose that effect of continuity across them. We don't know.
Now, these are interesting in a way because Diana is the violent protagonist in both these stories, essentially. So in Diana and Actaeon, we're seeing the moment when Actaeon is walking through the forest and comes across Diana and her nymphs bathing. And then you have Diana and Callisto, in which Diana is banishing a nymph who, through no fault of her own, who's been raped, is pregnant. Yeah. So here Diana turns the violent gaze onto these different people.
And I think Titian is going even further. He's pushing further in terms of the complexities of what he's trying to explore, complexity of identity, of again, emotional relation of power and so on in these pictures. And it is about two youthful innocents subjected to the brutality of fate, in a way, in the shape of Diana. It could also be the brutality of people who have more power than you. It could be both. It could be whatever you want it to be in that sense. These pictures are open for interpretation. But I think the theme of innocence and the place of empathy, the person we empathize with, is very clear in both of them. And we're getting really into really dark territory here. He gets increasingly dark in his, even though there's still a lot of humor and a lot of entertainment. There's a yapping dog in the front, and there's a lot of, it's a beautiful landscape. There's a lot to enjoy, and all these naked women, that clearly would have appealed to the audience that he was working for, Philip and whoever would see these pictures. He is sort of here making us reflect on the implications of looking and of being aroused or desiring something, and how those implications can be violent and horrible to others, or disastrous to ourselves.
Would Philip have understood that kind of subtle messaging in the work, do you think? Do we know about his interpretation?
I don't know. I don't even know to what extent Titian formulated these ideas for himself, but that seems to be what's going on. It's very difficult to say. We don't have anybody who wrote that this is what these pictures are about. But it seems, at least in this day, when you look at them, that's pretty much what, they're very powerfully about that. They could be about any number of other things too, of course. It's hard to say. I mean, they're also about man's place in nature and how man is like nature. Because these are all mostly taken for the metamorphosis and the change of shape. And the underlying theme of that is that man, like nature, constantly changes, is mutable. When we die, we rot, and plants spring forth, and animals come. And Ovid describes this, and I think this appeals to Titian, and it makes him think even more profoundly about placing figures in landscape, and depicting here decaying structures, man-made structures, decaying in nature, in very lush nature, and so on. So that's a theme too, and is this human nature, which is part of the greater continuum of nature, involves our drives and our desires and so on. And I think that's what he's looking at here.
I mean, and also, Titian is very old, especially for that time at this stage. Is he in his 70s yet? Yes, broadly, on his way to his 70s, and he must have been conscious of his own mortality.
Yeah. No, I think he was. Yeah, it's the kind of insight you gain with age, I think, it comes into this, of course. We know that he's concerned about securing his future, the future of his workshop, his children at this time, and he's trying to set up his workshop in a way that it can continue after his death, and to hold on to the patronage of Philip. It starts happening a bit later. It's mostly into the 60s that we really get that. But that is definitely a concern of his. He ends up living for a very long time.
Now, one of the striking things about Diana and Actaeon is that at the furthest right of the picture, you have a black figure, an African figure. Can you say something about that? What's the significance of this figure in the picture?
It's extremely interesting, and it tells us a lot of things about how Titian thought and how he worked. She's a late addition to the composition. Through infrared and X-ray, we can tell that she was originally white and she was positioned differently. At some stage, at a very advanced stage of painting, he decided to change her. And what is interesting when you look at her and compare her with the nymphs, the other female figures, is that they're all sort of generic in appearance. They're sort of beautiful, generic women. They're very interesting in terms of their psychology, but their physiognomy is kind of generic. The black woman is very specific, and I think she's a real person that Titian got interested in. Somebody he hired to model for him. And he probably, at a late stage, did a portrait drawing of her, a head study of her face, and then inserted her into the composition. Why he did this, there are various things we can guess at. Traditionally, art historically, people always talked about how she makes an interesting contrast in terms of the tone of her skin with Diana's very white skin, and that may be part of it. Just like her striped dress is very different from the state of undress of the others. She's clearly in a different role to the others. She seems to be a maidservant. She's dressed while the others are undressed, and she's helping Diana. And that mirrors contemporary society in Venice. There was a fairly substantial population of people of black African descent in Venice who often worked in menial roles. They were often servants and so on. But some rose to sort of greater social prominence. We know, of course, famously, Shakespeare's Othello is about a person of African descent who becomes very prominent in the military, and that was also the case. So here, what we're seeing is a black maidservant, and it was very prestigious in the northern Italian courts. This is not in Venice. This is in the courts of northern Italy to have dark-skinned servants, and you all often see that in portraits, including portraits by Titian, that people depict themselves with a black servant or page or something like that. In Venice, this was because it's not, Venice is a republic, it doesn't have nobles, and I think there was less of a culture of that kind of thing. But amongst sex workers, they replicated that model. So the sort of higher level courtesans would replicate the model of having a black maidservant. And
Does that then suggest something about the figure who is depicted as Diana?
Well, I mean, I think yes. I mean, so Venice was like had the biggest community of sex workers in Europe, and Titian clearly was familiar with it, and I think he got his models from there. I mean, that's been a theory, and actually we have some documentation of it that early in his career he did use. You know, you want somebody to pose in the nude, and Titian pioneered the female nude. It was not something that was a tradition for, at least the realistic female nude done from the live model. And I think that's how he got his models, is that he paid sex workers to pose for him, because it's not something you could get anybody else to do. So I think there's an allusion to contemporary society here that's not made evident but is there, you know, and that is fascinating too. Titian is an observer of life, even though this is a fantasy. It's close to life in other ways.
We're in front of the Rape of Europa now, and this is one of the two works that you would say are in the best condition of the group.
Yeah, it's in remarkably good condition, despite having, you know, traveled quite a lot in its time. It's the last of the poesie that Titian sends to Philip. And we have to remember the poesie are part of a larger commission that also involves religious paintings. And this is the last of that agreement they had. For Titian, we don't know exactly what the agreement was, but it was to provide a number of pictures of Titian's choosing, some mythological, some religious. And this one he sends to Madrid, where Philip has set up court in 1561. He sends this to Madrid, 1562, and describes it as the suggello, the seal to the deal, so to speak. It's the culmination, it's the end point of their collaboration. He will then, after this, pursue further collaboration and work for Philip, and to his death actually. But it's the closure of their deal, and in that sense, in him using that word, we get the sense that he thinks this is the high point.
It's difficult not to agree with you.
Yeah. It is an incredible picture, and the fact that it's in such good condition is great too. And it means you can go up and look at it close, in a way you unfortunately can't at the Gardner Museum where it belongs, because it hangs up high there. So it's harder. So this is really an opportunity to stick your nose in it and get a sense of Titian's brushwork and layering of color and to expressive effect.
So what's going on in the painting?
So this is the abduction of another princess by Jupiter, who's fallen in lust with her. She's called Europa, and Jupiter transforms himself into a bull to get her confidence, and she thinks the bull is so beautiful and cute that she eventually climbs on its back. And then the moment she does that, Jupiter the bull takes off into the water, because it's there on the seaside. Takes off into the water and takes her to Crete, and rapes her. It's another rape scene. And so it's a really horrible story. But Titian tries to get at, I think, what this means. You know, like what are the emotions? How do we get there? And Europa looks away from us. Her head is in shade, and this is a motif that was favored by Titian since the very early parts of his career. He always loved to put his protagonist in shade. So we can't really see her face. We can see her body. It's splayed out in front of us, slightly uncomfortably, but it's, you know, there's that factor of, you know, looking at a female body. The bull, in the meantime, catches our eye, and we look into those eyes, and initially it's funny and kind of cute, you know. So you can see why she was, you know, thought it was a cute bull.
It looks like it's giving us a knowing look.
Yeah. And so is the little Cupid down on the left, which is sort of looking up, sort of very indecently at her from its perch on a dolphin in the water.
Yeah.
So it's funny, you know. But the more you look at that bull, the more frightening, at least to me, it becomes. It seems inhuman. There's something unfeeling about it.
The sort of red around the eye is really dramatic, isn't it? Yeah.
And there's that horrible fish that comes up under her feet, you know, from the water with spikes and so on. There's an edge to this. And
can we imagine Titian going to the Rialto fish market?
Yes, I think it's some kind of monkfish that he's, you know, The dolphin is a sort of a model, sort of like typical sort of stylized dolphin. It doesn't look anything like the real thing, but that fish looks kind of real. So anyway, what Titian I think is getting at here is that, like the intensity of the color, the way that the moisture hangs in the air. We can feel the moisture on her skin, the way her skin ripples as she's being carried, that exclamation point of the red drapery. All of that is sort of passionate and ecstatic, and there's sort of a very ecstatic sort of aspect to this. But at the same time, it's sort of it's going further into something horrific and awful. I mean, it's a rape scene. So I think what he's trying to get at here is the very sort of blurred boundary between ecstasy and horror, and how something that can be wonderful one moment can be turned into violence. That's, for me, what that perch suggests, that uncomfortable perch, which he's almost sort of rolling off the back of the bull. So once again, we're dealing with the complexity of desire, of attraction, and the power dynamics in emotional relationship and sexual relationships. I think all of that is here.
Can we talk about the painting of it? Because it seems to me, Gabriele made the point earlier on, that these are not just visually enticing works, that they create a much more complex sensory atmosphere than that. That Titian's painterly effects really are all-consuming. They're almost immersive.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's this is something that he's skilled at from his early career. He uses visual means to engage the totality of our senses. Tactility, primarily. He has these tactile surfaces. It becomes more and more evident, like textures, the sensuality of skin. I mean, he loves flesh and painting flesh, especially female flesh, and so the tactility of that. But also here, you feel the moisture of the air. You can, and the relative coolness of the water, like the sensuality of having that drapery drag through the water. So there's that real sense of tactility here, and I think beyond that, sound. There's a lot of sound in his pictures. There's a lot of drama. So he's a synesthetic painter in that sense. Like one thing leads to the other, in terms of our senses, and that comes through in his painting. I mean, this is really, there's a contemporary description of a painting like this by Vasari, who's visited Titian's studio and said Titian's painting in this period looked like, a bit like a mess if you look up close. You can't decipher them, and then you step back and you realize that there's a meaning to the looseness of the paint. Everything comes together and looks wonderful. And so the way that Titian engages us physically, again, it comes back to what we talked about with Venus and Adonis, about the physical engagement sort of makes stimulating, but also the way we have to act with the picture to understand it, walk back and forth physically, and appreciate the fact that this is painting. This is not reality. It's not an illusion of reality. It's an interpretation, and it's Titian's interpretation. We can see his brushstrokes. We can appreciate his choices. And this is where Titian is such an important example to European art ever since. He lays down and consolidates the idea of painting as self-expression. And it happens in these pictures more than almost anything else he does.
We're standing in front of the Death of Actaeon, and have to say this beautiful light, natural light, has just fallen onto it because we have natural light, and it's just suddenly almost this sort of golden glow around the picture. Wonderful. This wasn't sent to Philip, this picture. It's the culmination of an earlier episode in the series. Tell us what's going on. So
this is the fate of Actaeon. The picture we saw earlier had Actaeon stumbling upon Diana and seeing her naked, and the punishment for that unforgivable transgression, of which he's completely innocent, is that he's turned into a stag. She turns him into a stag, and his hounds tear him apart. And that's what we see here. And then Titian, for good measure, has added Diana herself firing her bow at him, sort of delivering a coup de grace, maybe. And this picture, so when he delivered the two pictures, the Diana pictures, he wrote and said, I am now going to start work on the Europa and Actaeon torn apart by his hounds. So the Europa in this picture were probably started at 1559. Also, another indication is that they're on the same canvas weave. So they may be from the same bolt of canvas. It's not impossible. We can't prove it, but the weave is the same. For some reason, he decided not to finish it at that point and didn't ever send it to Philip.
And he said, as you say, that's it. The series is over. I can retire now, essentially, didn't he?
Well, he didn't want to retire. He wanted more work from Philip, but their agreement was finalized by that. But this picture he never sent to Philip, and he clearly picked it up later and painted it, to a very high state of completion. Finish is a more complicated word when you talk about this, because this is really Titian's late aesthetic, it's present in the poesie themselves for Philip. The fact that he will leave a painting in a variety of states of finish across the surface. Something can be quite highly worked, like her head. Other parts, like Actaeon's legs, are just suggested. And for Titian, this is fine, because that's his creative choice. Again, it's about calling attention to his choices. And for him, it's expression. It's not like obtaining some kind of ideal state of finish. It's about what it expresses. And he can really end it at any time. Beyond a certain point, he can stop painting and say, this is it. And that's a very modern notion of painting, and which we get into in subsequent centuries. That becomes part of a painterly aesthetic. And so this painting, this is the only painting that shows an actual physical transformation. All the stories have those in them, but this is the one that really shows it. Actaeon is halfway transformed into a stag here while he's being assaulted by his hounds. And he's almost merging with his surroundings, with the landscape around him, which is a very dramatic it's roiled by wind, and the water is agitated, and the dogs are running almost as if in motion blur. And there's a bush in front, which is just like yellow, sort of explosion of yellow. And I think, we're getting back to this theme of man being part of nature, and the transformations of nature also happening in us. And it's expressed through paint here. It's expressed through the execution. He's gotten to a point where he's confident and has discovered a means of doing that. And this is transformative for European painting.
So the greatest ever painter? You spend a lot of your time with 16th century Italian painting, which is some of the greatest painting ever. So what do you think? Where does Titian rank?
Well, he's up there. He's definitely up there. I think it's obviously an impossible question. Are you sort of going to start denigrating like Van Eyck? No. Or Velázquez, who learned so much from Titian, but is because he was actually managing these pictures in Philip IV's collection some generations later, and he learned a lot and knew Titian better than anybody, but was such a great artist himself that he could use those lessons for his own purposes, which is incidentally is going to be one of the exciting things about seeing this exhibition in the Prado, because these paintings will be paired with Velázquez and other paintings from the collection, also Rubens, for example, who copied these pictures and studied them intensely as well. There are many great painters.
Well, maybe we'll let the listeners come and see this exhibition and decide for themselves. Thank you so much, Matthias.
You're welcome.
Titian, Love, Desire, Death is at the National Gallery in London until the 14th of June, and at the Scottish National Gallery in Edinburgh from the 11th of July to the 27th of September. As Matthias says, some of the group will be shown in the exhibition Mythological Passions at the Prado Museum in Madrid from the 20th of October to the 10th of January 2021. And then the full set will travel to the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston from the 11th of February to the 9th of May next year. And that's it for this week. You can subscribe to the Art Newspaper at our website. Click on the subscribe link at the top left of the homepage. And please subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen and give us a rating or review if you've enjoyed it. Our producers are Julia Michalska, Amy Dawson and David Clack, and David is also our editing whiz. Thanks to Gabriele and Matthias, and thank you for listening. We'll see you next week. Bye for now. The Art Newspaper podcast is brought to you in association with Bonhams, auctioneers since 1793. To find out more